What does disproportional representation of poor and minority students mean? How does this relate to diversity in education, and why is it important to understand? During this lesson, we will discuss the topic of disproportionality among poor and minority students, along with related terms and concepts. With an understanding of diversity, culture, and related terminology in mind, let's move into a discussion of disproportionality and overrepresentation. When we speak of overrepresentation, we are referring to a situation in which greater numbers of students in certain groups receive special education services than would be expected based on their numbers in the school population. There is an overrepresentation of poor and minority students in special education programs. In contrast, underrepresentation means a situation in which fewer numbers of students of certain groups participate in gifted and talented programs than would be expected based on their numbers in the school population. There is an underrepresentation of minority students in gifted and talented programs. The overrepresentation of children from poor and minority populations receiving special education services has been identified as a problem for a very long time. It is reasonable to assume that the proportion of children with disabilities would be equally distributed across the population. However, data collected by the U.S. Department of Education has found for over 35 years that there are higher percentages of children from African American and Hispanic backgrounds with IEPs compared to the proportion of students in the school population as a whole. As the book points out, this situation is closely connected to socioeconomic status. Because there is a higher percentage of children from poor families with IEPs compared to the proportion of poor children in the school population as a whole, and because children from African American and/or Hispanic backgrounds are more likely to be poor, there are higher percentages of children from African American and Hispanic backgrounds. On the flip side, children from poor and minority populations are underrepresented in school programs for the gifted and talented. So the question is, why is this so? Unfortunately, there are no easy answers. For one thing, constantly saying overrepresentation in special education and underrepresentation in gifted and talented programs is a mouthful. For another thing, gifted and talented programs are a moving target. Many schools have cut special programs for the gifted and talented, and very few places ever had truly special programs for the gifted and talented to begin with. Most programs were enrichment or add-ons to the general education curricula and often involved self-selection. Furthermore, in high schools, there are not actually programs for gifted and talented children, but there are courses for highly motivated and high-achieving students, such as honors classes and AP classes. The first point we will make is that overrepresentation in special education services by students from poor and minority backgrounds is a symptom of the achievement gap. Simply put, the achievement gap is a difference between how low-income and minority children perform on educational indicators, such as standardized tests, high school graduation rates, college graduation rates, and other indicators of educational success, as compared to peers from more advantaged middle-class dominant culture backgrounds. Before moving on, let's take a look at a short clip put together by Vanderbilt University on bridging the achievement gap.
Classroom performance and achievement. These are two issues separated by huge disparities in our educational system. How we bridge the achievement gap for children of color will ultimately determine the success of America's future generations.
We are pretending as if we don't know that kids in lower income communities have less well-prepared teachers.
So we need schools that are student-centered and always factor in the human element. So we need to adapt to the students rather than always want the kids to adapt to us.
Teachers, have the high expectations of yourself. If you're going to expect them to jump high, you have to be up there to help them.
Why does achievement gap exist? Teachers, whatever your profession is, counselors, administrators, whatever, You have been ill prepared to work with populations that don't look like you.
That is the reality chipping away at our education system stability. Many studies and statistics show there is a widening chasm that does not permit equitable education for children of various racial, ethnic, and socio-economic backgrounds.
When you take unstandardized children from unstandardized backgrounds and unstandardized systems, give them a standardized test to determine their future, you can either determine that we have lost our mind and we're just too stupid to understand what it is we're doing. My goodness, why would we do that? Sounds so ridiculous. Or you can conclude that there's something about that that's quite deliberate.
We use the word achievement gap, and I used it for this conference for one purpose only, and that was because if I called it a debt owed to low-income minorities and other people who haven't had opportunity, no one would show up.
Leading researchers from Vanderbilt University's Peabody College invited other education thought leaders to share real-world strategies with educators. For several days, teachers and school administrators were given tools to help understand and bridge the achievement gap.
So rather than focusing on telling people to catch up, I think we have to talk about how we will begin to pay down the mountain of debt that we have amassed at the expense of entire groups of people and their subsequent generations.
We have to get to move teachers to a place where they really get to relate to their students, know how to relate, but then not only relating just for relationship standpoint, but relationships to improve academic achievement, because students want to know, one, do you care about me first? And then if I know you care about me, then I'll go with you.
Some factors that affect school performance may be beyond the control of the child or parents.
The achievement gap begins in the mother's womb. Before they even come out. You know why? Healthcare, housing.
Can you imagine a kid sitting in a classroom, not having eaten since yesterday at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, and now you're at school at 9 o'clock the next morning, and you want them to pay attention 5 hours later? Not going to happen. They're waiting for lunch.
The data and support are there for educators, school administrators, and communities to begin closing the achievement gap.
And if it's of interest to Vanderbilt, it becomes of interest to other institutions around the country. I think institutions of higher learning like Vanderbilt can work with their local school districts, and not only that, creating a workforce in terms of in-service teachers that work in these settings that will be able to hit the ground running.
There may be a price to pay if we continue to undereducate children of color and underfund schools in their neighborhoods.
Because in 25 years, it's going to be a half people of color, half white country. That's just a fact. If we are still as unequal, profoundly unequal then as we are today, we're not going to survive as a country. Bottom line, you can't maintain a healthy economy if half the population is twice as likely as the other half to be unemployed, 3 times as likely to be poor, 1/20th the net worth, double the rate of infant mortality, 9 years less life expectancy. You can't. So we have to have solidarity or we don't survive. I mean, it's that simple. It's equity or destruction. Those are the 2 choices, and that's it.
Remember this, low achievement comes before referral to special education. Not referring a child for special education services is not going to make the problem of low achievement go away. We could solve the problems of disproportional representation in special education by simply limiting the number of children from certain ethnic groups and cultural groups that could qualify for special education services, and in essence deny children services who qualify for them. However, such a solution would not solve the bigger problem of low achievement among poor, minority children, and that's the problem that needs to be solved. As we said, disproportional representation has been with us for a long time, and the Special Education Law, IDEA, has been amended to address this concern on several occasions. Amendments have been enacted to try and ensure that children are not misdiagnosed and prevent over-identification of poor and minority children. IDEA requires states to assess the efficacy of educational and transitional services for students with disabilities from diverse backgrounds. This means states are responsible for providing data each year on the progress of students from diverse backgrounds who receive special education students. States also must keep track of how many students from diverse backgrounds have IEPs. When school districts have significant overrepresentation of minority youth, the State Board of Education will cite school districts as part of their audit, and school districts will need to come up with a plan to both address the needs of students from poor and minority backgrounds and also address the overrepresentation problem. The goal would be for school districts to take some action so that in the future, their populations of students from poor and minority backgrounds who are in special education will line up more proportionally with students from other backgrounds. State intervention is the last resort, and this has happened in some school districts. For example, if proportionally twice as many African American students are receiving special education services compared to students from white middle-class backgrounds, then that would be a red flag for the State Board of Education. As we have mentioned, disproportional representation has been a long-term concept, and tracking the history of this issue can provide some fresh insights. Concern was first raised because special education was traditionally provided in a place other than the general education classroom, and these separate special education classrooms and schools were perceived to be dumping grounds for students who were low achievers. People were concerned that in the special education classrooms, there was a watered-down curriculum, and therefore children from poor and minority backgrounds that were overrepresented in these classrooms were being placed in learning environments where there were low expectations. One meaningful way to address one of the key concerns of overrepresentation is to expand the capacity of regular education classrooms to educate a more diverse array of students, which is of course the goal of the inclusive education movement. Compensatory education programs were intended to address the educational disadvantages of poor children. The most famous compensatory education program is the Head Start program. Compensatory education is also overrepresented by poor minority youth. However, no one sees this overrepresentation as a problem. People see compensatory education as something that is going to be helpful to the children. So there is a great amount of protest when funds for such programs get cut. The fact that there is overrepresentation of poor minority youth in compensatory education programs is seen as a good thing. There are many factors that contribute to overrepresentation. One cannot overstate the impact of poverty on poor achievement and eventual referral for special education services. The relationship between a family's socioeconomic status and disability, rather than between disability and minority group status, may be the best way to view factors contributing to overrepresentation. Conditions related to socioeconomic status that impact achievement and overrepresentation may include limited access to health care, poor nutrition, and adverse living conditions. These socioeconomic conditions are one of the main reasons that students from minority backgrounds are often overrepresented, because a higher percentage of minority families live in poverty. Why would being from a poor family put a child at risk for school failure and increase the likelihood of being identified for special education services? Take a moment to jot down a list of a few reasons. Did your list include lack of access to quality health care? From prenatal care to treatment of infections, poor children are not as healthy as more advantaged children, and physical health is related to learning. How about lack of access to nutritional food? Think of all the environmental risks associated with being poor, from growing up where there is lead paint because the houses are old and lead can reach toxic levels in the blood and cause learning problems, to the fact that if you are poor, you are more likely to live in a high crime area and be a victim of violence. Lack of access to books and other educational materials, not to mention perhaps lack of access to a parent who can help with homework, let alone money for a tutor if one-on-one help is needed. Middle-class families take such things for granted. the fact that there may not be a lot of models around who place a lot of emphasis on educational achievement. Poverty is a greater problem percentage-wise for U.S. citizens from minority populations. This is very important to remember because most people who are poor in America come from white European American backgrounds. However, percentage-wise, poverty is a greater problem in Hispanic and African American communities compared to other ethnic groups. Therefore, children from Hispanic and African American backgrounds are at greater risk of growing up in poverty. There are many other reasons why children living in poverty are disadvantaged in terms of school achievement. When one stacks all these disadvantages together, it is not hard to understand how two children with similar learning characteristics could have much different educational outcomes based on their family's socioeconomic status. For example, if we compare a child from a home with access to good resources to a child from a home without good resources, the child from the home without good resources could fall far behind achievement expectations in school and could be found eligible for special education services. As we close, the following video provides some specific statistics of over and underrepresentation of minority groups in special education.
Take all of your wasted honor, every little past frustration. Take all of your so-called problems, better put them in quotation. Say what you need to say, say what you need to say. Say what you need to say, 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 say what you need to say. Walking like a one-man army, fighting with the shadows in your head, living out the same old moment, knowing you'd be better off instead if you could only say what you need to say, 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 say what you need to say. Have no fear for giving in, have no fear for giving over. You better know that in the end it's better to say too much than never to say what you need to say again. Even if your hands are shaking and your faith is broken, even as the eyes are closing, do it with a heart wide open. Say what you need to say, say what you need to say, say what you need to say, say what you need to say.